Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who are going to be facilitating an off-campus small group through Dayspring's ministry. If you're going to be leading that small group on the week of October the 26th, this video is designed to help you get ready to do that, all right? So grab the Going Deeper guide that's going to be used this week. You should have a copy of that already. I'm going to look at it with you. I'm going to say some things along the way. Maybe you can jot those down, and maybe that'll help you as you get ready to lead your group this week. So let's look at it. Discussion point number 1. We always start like this. It takes you to the passage from Sunday, and then you and your group recap this together. Now, let me give you a little bit of insight about Sunday in case you're watching this before Sunday. Sunday's sermon is about Rahab, found in Joshua chapters, the very beginning of Joshua, and then on into Joshua 6 in the Old Testament. And Rahab was a non-Israelite prostitute who ended up being used of God to help the Israelites come and conquer the land that God had promised to them. So she's an unlikely hero, and that's what this small group discussion guide is going to be about. It's going to be about the fact that God uses people and calls people who, quite frankly, aren't the ones that we would have thought He would use. God chooses unlikely heroes, so to speak. So that's what this is about. And Rahab was certainly an example of that. What you're going to end up doing is looking at another example in the life of Moses. But discussion point number 1, you're getting into that, and you're just kind of recapping what you hear Sunday. So take some good notes yourself so that you can guide the conversation on discussion point number 1, and let that one go wherever the conversation leads until it kind of comes to a close. From there, you move on to discussion point number 2. Look at what it says, and this is where you get into that subject matter of unlikely heroes. It says, "It has been said that the Bible is full of unlikely heroes, people such as Rahab, who by now you will have already read about and discussed." It says, who are some of the other unlikely Bible heroes? And at this point, you're really getting people to throw out the names and stories of those that the Bible talks about in a positive light, and you're saying, here's some people that I think of who were unlikely heroes, whether it was the young David boy who slew the giant, or Jonah, who is a hard-headed prophet who ends up taking a message to a nation who experiences nationwide revival. Any of the disciples, just choose them. Matthew, the tax collector, Simon Peter, the son of a fisherman, who tends to put his foot in his mouth a lot. On and on you could go, Rahab certainly being one of them. But at this point, you're just kind of conversing about the fact that God uses unlikely heroes. And from there, you segue into your Bible text, which is found on discussion point number 3. It says, think about this. If God is in the business of choosing unlikely people to do His work, then He has surely heard His share of quote-unquote good excuses from those that He has called. And that really makes sense when you think about it. If God tends to call people who really are unlikely candidates, then surely He's heard His share of, but God, are you sure? Or, but God, how about, somebody else, or whatever it may be. Surely God has heard a lot of that throughout the ages. Maybe you're one of the ones who said such a thing to God. I know that I have in my own life. When God called me to ministry, that was my initial response was, probably somebody else should do this. God has heard a lot of that. Moses is a person who is one of those individuals, and what you're about to do now with your group, you're going to read the account of Moses being called by God, given the task of going into Egypt and leading the Israelites out, and what you're going to see is that Moses offered a series of excuses, but God also offered a series of responses. So that's where you're going to head to. Discussion point number 3. You're going to read Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 10 as a group. And what you might want to do before y'all read those verses, maybe you can give a quick summary of what's going on here, and you don't have to be a Bible genius to do this, okay? Here's the background. Moses was born in Egypt, raised as an Egyptian by the Pharaoh's own daughter, but Moses ends up killing an Egyptian. One day Moses is defending the Hebrews is what he's doing. There's an Egyptian who is mistreating a Hebrew. Moses gets so furious about this because now he knows the Hebrews are his own people. He ends up killing the Egyptian. Because of that, Moses ends up having to run for his life, and he moves far away. He's in a secluded place. Many, many years go by. He's kind of established his own life away from Egypt and all that came with that. It's in that context now that God comes to him. So you may just want to remind people of Moses' background, that he was raised in Egypt, killed an Egyptian, left Egypt. Now he's about to have this conversation with God. Then you read it. And it's Exodus 3, verses 1 through 10. It's the account of Moses at the burning bush. All right? So you and your group read that. Then you move on to discussion point number 4. Look at this. It says, Moses would offer up a series of excuses as to why God should not call him for this work. Scan through the following responses from Moses. Then in your own words, sum up his excuses. So what you're going to do, you're going to read these 4 passages one at a time. But after you read one, go around the group and say, okay, so generally what was Moses' excuse here? Or maybe what you can do is read the passage and then have everyone write down their paraphrase of what Moses' excuse was. And then you can share those together as a group and kind of see if people came up with the same general idea. So let's talk through these 4 together. I'm not going to read you the passages, but I'm going to tell you in general what his excuse was in the way that I would word it. Your first one is Exodus chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. And here's basically what I would say his excuse was on this one. Moses basically says to God that somebody else would do a better job of leading the people out of Egypt. That's basically what his excuse is. And that was my general thought when I felt a call to ministry, because I knew several ministers and they kind of fit a certain profile. They had certain personality types, certain skill sets that I didn't really see in myself. So my first thought and inclination when I felt a tug to go into ministry was, there are probably other people who could do better than I could. So I just need to move on and do something else. But obviously God had a call on my life, and that wasn't a good excuse. This is the excuse that Moses offers, is there's probably somebody who could do a better job. Now look at the second one, Exodus 3, verses 13 through 20. Here's basically the excuse I hear from Moses on this one. Moses is very honest on this one when he basically says to God, this isn't really a good plan. I mean, that's kind of what I hear Moses saying here. There are too many holes. There are too many possible ways that this whole thing could go wrong, God. And God is gracious to give Moses an answer of saying, well, here's how it's going to play out. And I want you to go tell the leaders in Israel that this is how it's going to play out. And you can imagine that their response would have been the same as Moses's. How is this really going to work? So Moses gives this excuse of, this isn't really a good plan. I think there's a better plan. Now, here's what you might bring up here as part of this discussion. I don't think any of us would ever have the audacity to outright say to God, God, that's a bad plan. Your plan is a bad plan. I don't think any of us would say that in those terms. So maybe here's a question that you could offer to the group. How do we use the same excuse with God but say it in such a way that we don't sound so bad? What are some ways that we kind of spiritualize this excuse even, and even make it sound like it's a good excuse? What are the ways that we tend to say that? I mean, think about this. Has there ever been a time where maybe you knew what God wanted you to do, but you said something like, well, I'm going to wait until I get a peace about it. Have you ever heard people say that? I'm going to wait till I get a peace about it. Or maybe you didn't go through with something that you knew that God had led you to do, and the way you worded it to people was, yeah, God never really opened the door for me there. He just never, the doors kept closing, so I discerned that wasn't God's will. I think there are a lot of ways that we lean on this excuse without saying it. Because the bottom line is, we don't like God's plan. We see how it could fall apart, especially if we're the ones executing the plan. But I would remind you of a couple of things here in the Bible. Some passages that may be helpful for you as you facilitate this particular discussion with your group. Isaiah chapter 55, verse 9 is a great verse in the Bible that talks about God's plan. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Pretty familiar verses for some of the people in your group. But it all shows us that the excuse of God's plan doesn't make sense to me And maybe that's a better way of wording Moses' excuse here. God's way, this thing that God is leading me to, it just really doesn't make sense. I can't figure this all out. Um, it, God totally destroyed that excuse in his response to Moses. All right, here's a third one. Exodus chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. Moses' excuse here, as I would sum it up like this, Moses says, this is going to be too hard. This is going to be too difficult. I'm not going to like it. It's going to be too uncomfortable. That's Moses' excuse here. And here's what I would say about this excuse. This is an excuse that we use oftentimes because there is a brand of American Christianity that says that you can discern God's will because it's always going to be one that basically that's going to be fun. There are preachers who teach that, God's will is eventually, not only is it going to work out right, but it's going to be fun all along the way. Man, God is going to fill you with joy as you do his work. Here's the reality. Much of what God calls us to do is not easy, and it's not even fun. We don't even like it in the process. So maybe you can ask this question to your group. Maybe you can ask them, say, hey, is God's will always fun? Is doing God's will always a fun journey? Once you ask that question, then ask this. Are there examples in the Bible of people who the journey wasn't fun? Now, if you were to ask me that question, I would offer up Moses as Exhibit A. I mean, if you'll just scan through his life, this thing that God called him to do in leading the Hebrews, I mean, if you want to see how fun it was, scan through and look at like Exodus 15, 16, or 17. Look at how hard it was to lead the people, and look at how they treated him. Look at Numbers 12, 14, or 16. Look at how hard this was for Moses, and look at how the people treated him. I do not think that Moses would have told us, hey man, God called me to do this, and I was reluctant, but I did it. And I tell you what, it ended up being a fun journey. I don't think he would say that. There are other examples. Think of a guy like Jeremiah in the Old Testament. He's referred to as the weeping prophet. You know why he's referred to as the weeping prophet? Because God told him to go to Israel and say a specific message, and nobody listened to him. In fact, if you'll look at Jeremiah, look at the book of Jeremiah, chapter 1, then look in chapter 7, like at verse 27. God tells Jeremiah, you're going to say this to the people, and they're not going to listen to you. In other words, I'm going to give you a very unpopular sermon to preach to the Israelites where they're going to reject it, and you're going to end up crying. That's not a fun journey. You want some other examples? Here's a great one. Stephen in the New Testament. Stephen followed Jesus very well. Read about his journey in Acts chapter 7. The Apostle Paul, as we know, followed Jesus very well. Look throughout the book of Acts. Specifically, look at Acts chapter 19. You tell me if it was a fun journey. My whole point is this. We lean on the excuse a lot that if it's not going to make me happy, then it must not be God's will. And Moses leans on that excuse. He says, God, this is going to be really, really difficult. And the funny thing is, God doesn't come back and say, oh, no, Moses, you're wrong. You're going to love it. God didn't offer that response because it wouldn't have been true. And Moses' life bears evidence to this. So that's a third excuse there. And again, I encourage you as a group leader, facilitate this discussion. Ask people, do you think doing God's will is kind of a happy trail to walk down? Do you think that once we resist and finally give in, that once we get on the path, we realize it's actually a lot of fun? Sometimes that's true, but God doesn't make the promise that it is true because oftentimes it's not. So here's a fourth excuse that Moses offers in verses 10 through 17 of chapter 4. Basically, Moses says, I don't have a good skill set. Basically says, I don't talk very well. Or he would have probably said it, I don't talk good. He probably wouldn't have said it, properly. I don't talk good, he says. And of course, God responds to this one as well and says, well, you've got your brother who does speak well, and he's going to be with you. So what you've done at this point is you have gone through 4 different excuses that Moses has offered, and hopefully you and your group in reading these have noticed that every time that God responds, and this leads you to discussion point number 5. Look at this. It says, with each excuse, God provided a simple rebuttal. And here it was, and you should notice this. God's response every time is basically I'm going to be with you. You know, when Moses says, I'm not the right person for the job, God says, well, I'll be with you. When Moses says, your plan doesn't make sense to me, God says, well, I'm going to be there with you. When Moses says, it's going to be too difficult, God says, well, I'll be there with you. And then when Moses says, I don't even speak well, I can't even communicate this to people, God gets a little upset on that one. And then God says, well, I'm going to send your brother Aaron with you. So, which is interesting there, God doesn't say, I'm going to be with you. He says, Aaron's going to be with you, which brings you to this discussion point on number 5. It says God's presence would overcome anything that would keep Moses from doing God's will. Interestingly, one of God's answers was not, I'll be with you, but Aaron will be with you. So discuss this statement. Here's the statement that you and your group are going to discuss. God helps us to do his will by surrounding us with people who can do his will. And what you're really doing here is you're focusing on this one element of how God is with us. In this one instance in which God has said time and time again, you're going to do the work because I'm going to be with you. Now he says Aaron's going to be with you. So what you're talking about here is this. Isn't it interesting that one of the ways that God is with us is through each other? That God manifests his presence through one another's presence in our life. So maybe what you can do in discussing the statement is remind your group that God manifests himself through his body, and his body is us. And maybe some interesting reading you could do on this, and maybe even something you read as a group. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 12 through 17. Notice how God does his work through his people. It's God doing the work, but it's through his people. So the whole point here in this discussion is that God calls us to do his work. And there may be 101 good reasons why we can think of somebody else who should have been called, or why we shouldn't do it, or how the plan is surely going to fail. We can come up with all of these reasons, but the reality is this, and it's stated on discussion point number 6. That's not a discussion point, it's just really a finishing point for you. It says, the old adage is true, that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And he qualifies us by being with us as we go. It's his very presence that qualifies us. And how God's presence goes with us, it may just be him and us. It may be that his presence comes through the people who are around us. But if God calls us, let's have the faith to obey, knowing that his presence will be among us and that that's going to be plenty. All right? Hopefully this has been good for you to listen to as you get ready to lead this discussion. Hopefully some of the extra Bible verses may come in handy as you get ready to facilitate the discussion. But thanks for listening in. May you and your group have a great meeting. We'll see you Sunday.